Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome back to New Books in Law, a channel on the New Books Network. I'm Jane Richards, and today I'm speaking with Dan Mattingly about his latest book published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press. It is The Art of Political Control in China. Dan Mattingly is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Yale University. His research focuses on the politics of authoritarian regimes, historical political economy, and China. His book that we're discussing today, The Art of Political Control in China, was named as one of the best books of 2020 by Foreign Affairs magazines. Daniel Mattingly, welcome to the show.
Jane, thank you so much for having me on.
It's our pleasure. Now, just to get us started, I'm wondering if you can tell me how you came to write The Art of Political Control in China.
Absolutely. So, The Art of Political Control in China is a book that it started as a dissertation for which I did over a year of on-the-ground field research in China, interviewing people, doing surveys. But to understand how I came to ask the central question of the book, which is really the question of how do states control society? All states, to one degree or another, want to control society, to implement policy, to implement laws, to get revenue and tax money from people. You have to go, I think, a little bit further back in my personal history to the first time I lived in China, which was 2004 to 2006, when I was a teacher in Hunan province in China. And I went with some of my colleagues on this really amazing boat cruise down the Yangtze River from Chongqing to Wuhan. And this was in the middle of the Three Gorges Dam filling up, right? So as we were going down this river, you would see these really kind of striking visual reminders of just how effective, strong, powerful, and able to control society the Chinese state is. So we were going down the river at this period, and we would see all these towns that had been completely abandoned and evacuated, these ghost towns, for the creation of the Three Gorges Dam. And I think there's a sort of amazing facet of the Chinese state. If you think about the ability of the state to move millions of people off their land for this big project like the Three Gorges Dam, and was something that kind of intrigued me. I think there's maybe from a normative perspective, from an environmental perspective, there are ways to critique these big state-run development projects like the Three Gorges Dam or urbanization projects. But at the same time, it's fascinating and astounding, I think, that the Chinese state, especially relative to other developing states, has been able to implement things like the Three Gorges Dam. So you're able to go down the Yangtze River and see, at least in this period of time, 2005, 2006, see all these ghost towns. Millions of people moved off their land. So that was the kind of partially the deep history, the impetus for writing this book was just being intrigued by how is it that the Chinese state is so effective and able to control society in the way that a lot of developing states are not.
That's really interesting, and I do think that comes through in the book. I guess it relates to it. So because you open the book with a quote from Sun Yat-sen. Now, he was the first president of the Republic of China in 1911 after the revolution, which overthrew the last of the Chinese dynasties, which was the Qing dynasty. He also later became the leader of the Kuomintang, which was the Chinese Nationalist Party during that era. So your opening quote of the book from Dr. Sun in 1924 is that he says, "How can a government be made all-powerful? Once the government is all-powerful, how can it be made responsive to the will of the people?" Now, I think this applies to the example that you just gave us and also really well to the hypothesis of your book. Can you explain how you think the art of political control has helped to make the government of China all-powerful, and also how this all-powerful government can be made responsive either because of or despite this political control?
Well, that's a really important question, right? It's this sort of central dilemma for all governments. Before Sun Yat-sen said that in 1924, one of the founding fathers of the United States, James Madison, said something similar about, in framing a government, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and then in the next place oblige the government, to control itself. So this kind of paradox is, I think, central to all governments, not just the Chinese government. But from the perspective of someone like Sun Yat-sen writing just after the fall of the Qing dynasty, in the context of China that had been pushed around by foreign powers and a government under the Qing, and then under ultimately under the nationalists as well, that wasn't that effective. You do first need a government that's able to implement policies and get things done and move the country forward. And then, of course, the next challenge is, how can you also make that government responsible to itself, not corrupt, not predatory? So the answer that I have in this book focuses mostly on this first question of, how do you create a government that's really effective and able to control the population that it governs? And I think the key to understanding this is, it's not all about coercion. So I think that, especially in the West, there's this idea about authoritarian governments that they rule mostly through coercion. It's things like the secret police, surveillance systems, censorship, automated facial recognition technology. That sort of really coercive tools of governance are how authoritarian governments ensure compliance from the people they govern, ensure that people, don't protest against the state, pay their taxes on time, and act in the way they're supposed to. What I argue in the book instead is that it's the authoritarian states often rely on society to police and control itself in ways that aren't as immediately coercive or obviously coercive or violent as, I think, the picture that a lot of people have, especially in the West and Western democracies, of how authoritarian governments govern. And so in the book, I talk about 3 different strategies that authoritarian states use to try to control society. The first is to kind of cultivate and subvert civil society organizations, organizations outside of the state, outside of the family, and firms that are actually useful for authoritarian governments to monitor society, control society, and promulgate values that are useful for ensuring compliance. Authoritarian states also often co-opt, as a second strategy, influential social leaders who, especially at the local level, at the grassroots level, can be very helpful for states to ensure compliance with what states want, whether that's not protesting or some kind of revenue extraction. And then the third strategy I talk about is infiltration. And I think this is something that, of the 3 strategies I talk about, this is what's gotten the most press in the last 3 years in the West, which is this idea that Leninist political systems, or kind of quasi-Leninist political systems like the Chinese Communist Party's political system, invest also a lot in creating parastate organizations, whether it's Communist Party cells or neighborhood committees, that penetrate down to the grassroots and are useful for monitoring and controlling society. So it's those 3 strategies, to come back to your original question, that are the key to understanding how the state controls society. They're subverting civil society, co-opting civil society social leaders, and infiltrating society. This question of how you get responsibility, on the other hand, I argue comes mostly from being able to sort of free yourself from the state-controlled organizations. So it's actually surprisingly the places that have the least robust social organizations in some contexts, especially in places like rural China, that are most able to act spontaneously and to resist the state at the local level.
That's really interesting. As you say, there is this conception, especially from Western liberal democratic ideals, that, this coercion is sort of more repressive, and it's not it's not these systems of informal control. So one of your key findings in your research, you write that the presence of civil society groups helps officials in rural China tamp down on protests, requisition land, and enforce mandatory birth quotas. In short, local civil society groups in China help strengthen state capacity and serve hidden tools of informal control. And I mean, when I was reading your book, I was really surprised because I sort of would have assumed that the opposite is true. Certainly, before I came to your book, I did play into that sort of typical Western liberal mindset, I guess. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I think, I think that there's a good reason for that, which is that what we would think of as civil society looks quite different in a liberal democracy than it does in an authoritarian state like China. So the same kinds of civic social organizations, whether it's purely social organizations like bird watching clubs, dance troops, soccer clubs, or whether it's more kind of adversarial groups like NGOs, or even NGOs that are designed to provide social services. I mean, in the West, these kinds of groups can actually be used to create social capital that bond people together, and that can then ultimately be used for political organization of different kinds. That vision of what social organizations do in Western democracies really doesn't fit or make any sense if you try to import that into an authoritarian context like mainland China today, where these social organizations, to the extent that they exist because the party, Communist Party, and the state allow them to exist, which means they've often served some sort of useful purpose for the state. So this idea that I think a lot of Westerners have, which in the United States maybe comes from the work of Alexis de Tocqueville writing about how civic organizations at the local level in the United States create habits of the heart that help to strengthen democracy at the local level, don't really make sense in authoritarian contexts like China.
So then I guess my next question is, who are the civil society groups that you focus on in the book?
So the book is mostly about rural China. So I did field research largely in rural China and the book has a bunch of essentially case studies of villages in China. So I'm looking mostly at kind of village level society, which means that I'm looking at a set of pretty social groups that are kind of specific to villages. Things like lineage associations. These are kinship associations, extended networks, when in some contexts are called clans. Although if you want to get deep into it in the anthropological literature in China, there's a distinction made between lineages and clans. But the thing here to know is that these are extended kinship networks that have often associations at the village level. I also look at temple organizations, especially folk religious temple organizations, which are common, especially in parts of southern coastal China, although they exist in many other places in China. I also look at things like music groups and local festival associations, which are maybe closer to the kinds of civic associations that Westerners and many listeners might be familiar with. And I also look at parastate organizations. So I specifically look at what are called villager small groups, which are groups of often a few dozen households that are grouped together in a village that often have a small group leader who's kind of like the local neighborhood's watch leader, who's responsible for helping to promulgate and enforce policy at the local, who's helps the village committee and the village party secretary to roll out policy. So these are all kind of, I think, from a certain perspective, organizations that you don't see elsewhere. You don't see in urban China and you don't see outside of China. But I do think that there's a kind of core here that does travel, I think, beyond rural China to how these organizations work, even if the specific social forms are specific to rural China. I think in the big picture, they look a lot like civic groups elsewhere. So in the book, I kind of try to draw in examples that at least are fun for me to write about of other kinds of social groups, whether it's thinking about the role of or the Orthodox Church in Russia, or civic groups in the United States, or clans in Scotland. I do try to help readers understand how these findings might travel.
And that's really interesting. So then you've touched on this already. You talked about subversion, cooptation, and infiltration. But then can you expand a little bit more on how autocracies, and especially in China, use these groups to subject citizens to coercive controls and what the ultimate political outcome is?
Yeah, so the book really focuses on explaining three things about what the Chinese Communist Party is doing in rural China. And these are the kind of key outcomes, in a sense, that the party cares about in in rural China in terms of governance outcomes, setting aside poverty alleviation, which is one of the most, which is one of the important outcomes in terms of what the state wants from society. Partly, it's first political control, lack of ensuring there isn't protest, land requisitions. So, in order to understand how urbanization and development happens in China, it usually involves, especially in the early 2010s, huge amounts of land requisitions, where land from farmers was requisitioned by the state and then converted to urban or industrial use. Farmers, in some cases, especially if they live near big cities, got pretty good compensation, but in parts of more rural China, we're actually often, as I show in the book, getting pretty bad compensation. Nowhere near what the land was worth, and we're on balance unhappy with it. And the third policy I look at is family planning policy. What used to be called the one-child policy. Obviously, that has changed as China's demographics have changed. But in the past, the one-child policy was one of the key policy outcomes that the state cared about in rural China until about 5 years ago. And so the question is, how can the state control society and do things like requisition land, the most valuable asset that most farmers have, and do things like enforce the one-child policy, which in rural China was relatively unpopular, more popular in urban China, but was relatively unpopular in rural China. And do those two things without encountering large amounts of protest. So what I argue in the book is that these local social groups are quite useful for the state for enforcing these policies without running into protests and without using violence and coercion to get people to do what they want. So to give you an example, talk about the current paramount leader of China, the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping. Right, Xi Jinping today is at the apex of power in China, but he started off his career as a teenager, as a sent-down youth during the Cultural Revolution, when he was sent down to a village, and he eventually became the party secretary of this village during the Cultural Revolution. And he wanted to make his mark on the village. So the first project that he wanted to do was to build this big dam in this village, which would potentially benefit villagers by making irrigation easier. And he wanted to roll out this plan, but quickly ran into a problem, which was that in order to build a dam, it would involve having to dam up land that was a cemetery for the dominant lineage group in the village. So, lineage groups, again, are these extended kinship networks in this village of Liangjiahe, which is where Xi Jinping was sent. Lineage ties were very strong, very important. So how was Xi Jinping, what was the strategy that he used then to try to get this lineage group to give up its land? Well, he actually found these lineage group ties to be quite useful, because what he could do was, instead of Xi Jinping himself having to go and, as this teenager, try to convince these older villagers who'd been there their whole lives to try to move off their land, the fact that there were these strong lineage ties and lineage associations meant that he could go to the lineage elders and ask the lineage elders to persuade other members of their lineage, specifically this holdout family, to move off their land. So that's what Xi Jinping did. He went to the lineage elders, and the lineage elders kind of twisted arms until they got this one holdout family to move off their land. They were able to then build a dam. So this is Xi Jinping at the very beginning of his career, understanding how to operate the levers of power, and understanding at a very kind of micro level, at the village level, the community level, how to get things done. And it was important for him to be able to work through these social groups in order to ensure compliance and Communist Party control in this village. And so the book, this is one example. It's probably of the most famous person alive today in China, using these tactics, but looking across a broader set of villages. I argue that it's often things like these lineage associations or dance groups or what have you that are useful for political leaders for doing a couple things. One, identifying who is unhappy and who needs sort of political work done on them, and two, in a kind of non-coercive or non-violent way, trying to persuade them to go along with what the state wants, whether that's giving up that parcel of land for a development project for a dam, or whether it's complying with the one-child policy.
And so I guess my next question is, applying this sort of experience of Xi Jinping more broadly, from what your findings, how do you think that civil society can be cultivated to encourage deference to the state?
Yeah, so to a certain extent, the relationship between these groups and the state is somewhat, symbiotic or mutual, and it can be delicate, especially given the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party to try to actively cultivate local civil society. So there's specific barriers for Communist Party leaders in rural China when it comes to cultivating certain types of groups. So if it's something like a lineage association or a temple association, the charter, the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party forbids, restricts, discourages party leaders from participating in some of these organizations, or donating to some of these organizations, or trying to directly cultivate them. So this means that in some cases, when it comes to these groups that are under sort of official party ideology discouraged, it means that local leaders have to be careful not to themselves directly cultivate it, but sometimes can either take advantage of the fact, number one, that someone else, like a kind of local, you can think of them as kind of social entrepreneur in the village, has already done something like try to revive the village lineage association, a kinship association. That's one tactic, is just to sort of allow something that's naturally happening anyway to happen, to support it, to not tamp down and prevent it, because these organizations are often useful. The other strategy is, to kind of more directly themselves try to cultivate something. And when it comes to things like lineage and temple associations, where they maybe can't directly participate themselves, you can still work. People often, work through their families, their wives, sons, daughters, cousins, to try to more indirectly cultivate these civil society groups. So one way you can do this at the local level is, when I was actually doing field work, you could go and look at, go inside these lineage associations, these really beautiful ancestral halls, and with many of them with these kind of fantastic, colorful murals. And you can really understand why these places have meaning to people and to their families, and places. So these are things that people are justly proud of. And but you can go and then see on the wall these rolls of donors to these organizations, and often it's not that hard to figure out, who, whether the village party secretary or members of the village party secretary's family have donated to it, and often their names are kind of at the head of these rolls of people who've donated, and they've often their families have often donated the most. In a way that encourages and cultivates their own social prestige, which is useful, right? If you want to enforce policy, it helps to be to not just rule with an iron fist, but with a velvet glove. To have the social prestige that comes from being seen as a good citizen who's trying to cultivate social organizations in your village. So it's not an insidious tactic, but it's certainly a useful tactic for officials who are attempting to cultivate political control.
And I mean, one of the examples that you use in the book, where it really isn't insidious at all, you talk about norm creation via informal civil society networks, and you mentioned before the case studies that you've done. So two of them, one's from Guangdong and the other one is in Anhui. So I'm wondering if you can just elaborate a little bit more on these case studies and tell us what they demonstrate with regard to this coercive control and norm creation in this way.
Absolutely. So I did a fair amount of field work in in Guangdong, both near Guangzhou, and a little bit of field work in eastern Guangdong. And so one of the cases I talk about in this chapter is the case of Yang Village, where the Chinese Communist Party secretary and the village leadership did things like promoting cultural associations, ping pong club, singing troops, traditional music groups, even a dragon boat racing team. And these were immensely popular in the village. I think that brought Liu and the members of his family a fair amount of prestige and increased their popularity in the village. And so these are by no means like bad things. So I think when talking about the term political control here, it's I hope a sort of, in some sense, it's kind of neutral term. I mean, I think that you can make normative judgments about the ways in which people exercise political control. But these bonds were also useful for Liu to implement policy, including things like land requisitions, which was a priority of the local government. And so when he was doing this, the village government, wanted to redevelop the village land, which would involve essentially moving everybody out of their houses and building a set of apartment buildings, high-rise buildings there. And some people thought this was a good idea, thought the compensation was fine, but there were a lot of holdouts. There were hundreds of holdouts who didn't want to move, who didn't think the compensation was good enough. And it was, looking at the compensation, it was, certainly the village was going to get more money than the villagers were being compensated. The compensation it's not like someone could live off the compensation necessarily for the rest of their life. But people were, some people liked it, some people didn't. So how did they move people off? Well, one thing that they tried was postering the village with these posters that really explicitly tried to call on the norms of filial piety that these lineage associations that Liu and his family had cultivated. So one of the posters said, fighting the relocation compensation shows a lack of filial piety and a hard heart. And another one of them tried to call on the norms created again by these lineage associations of respect for elders, saying, refuse relocation and be censured by the elders, shirk responsibility, and people point, show respect and filial piety, move early for a better environment. So we're very explicitly calling on these norms created by lineage groups in order to try to get people to move off their land, which I thought was just kind of fascinating. I don't know how effective these particular posters were in getting people to sign the papers to move off their land. But clearly, Liu and his family thought that they were pretty effective. The other case that you mentioned, which I assume is Xiaogang Village. So it's actually not in Anhui. There's a very famous village called There's a very famous village called Xiaogang Village in Anhui. I don't know why. So I renamed all the villages for this book in order to preserve the anonymity of the respondents who talked to me. I don't know why. I picked Xiaogang because it was a famous village, but you found this secret.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Sorry.
It's like an Easter egg in this book for people who really care about rural China. But it's not the Xiaogang village. It's another village with a name that was actually, anyway, it's close enough to Xiaogang. I thought it'd be fun to name it Xiaogang, but I guess it's misled somebody who knows a lot about China. In this case, it was kind of a similar story to the story of Xi Jinping trying to build the dam, which was that this village of Xiaogang, they wanted to upgrade it's actually in Henan province, not Anhui. They wanted to upgrade their electrical system. They wanted this farmer to move off the land in order to upgrade it. Basically, they're going to have to put a pole in his field. And this farmer was like, I don't want you to because it's going to take up part of my land. I'm going to have to lose some of my crop every year. You're going to put this pole in my field without giving me anything. And basically, again, this is useful for the fact that this village had really strong associations meant that, the local, party cadre. So I talked to the party secretary of this village, who was, exasperated by this guy who wouldn't move off his land or wouldn't give up, this piece of land for this electrical pole that was going to benefit everybody in the village. He told me well, what did I do? I went to basically his uncle, um, and in the clan and in the lineage group, and told him to put some pressure on this guy to do it. And basically, because this elder came to him, it was really hard for him socially. It was really hard for him to refuse without being, well, not, he wouldn't have been ostracized necessarily from the village, but he would have looked bad. So he did end up moving off of his land. So these norms, again, of deference to and respect for elders, there's nothing inherently bad about this set of norms at all. But the point I'm making in the book is that it's useful for the state for implementing policy.
That's interesting, because I think what the case studies demonstrate is this system of political control is pretty effective. But then at the same time, there are real limits to political control in this sort of coercive way. So I wonder if you can talk a bit now about what you see as the key challenges then to the Communist Party's system of political control that happens in this sort of non-repressive, non-violent, coercive system.
Yeah, well, I mean, so a couple of things. Well, first, I don't want to diminish the fact that there is a repressive, coercive, violent dimension to political control in China and authoritarian systems. I mean, I think the obvious case that's important to talk about here is Xinjiang, where the way that political control is exercised is quite coercive. It's through camps, intense surveillance, jailing people, and systematic human rights abuses. So I don't want to suggest that all political control all the time in China and authoritarian systems is non-coercive, because it is repressive, and you have cases like Xinjiang where there are human rights violations that are happening and extraordinary amounts of repression. I do think so. With that important caveat, most of the time in authoritarian systems like China, that's not how the state is operating. And I think you can look at ebbs and flows and ups and downs of how what the tools of political control that states use are. But one set of things that I think is always in the kind of quiver of authoritarian states are these more informal, less coercive sets of tools for political control that often that people in the past have paid less attention to. So, getting back to this question of what are the challenges, I'd highlight two of them. The first is that these strategies of political control, they can become in some cases less effective over time, and they are they're flexible, which means that they might not have the rigidity that some leaders want. So what do I mean by that? Well, first, when it comes to some of these tactics of political control, you think about cultivating local elites, or trying to co-opt the leaders of lineage groups in order to do things like requisition land. Well, if you do this in the context of what you could think of as a kind of repeated interaction, like then a game theorist might talk about a repeated game, it does create incentives for everybody to sort of behave themselves over the long run. So if I'm asking you to pay your taxes, to pay fees to the state, to maybe give some of your land to the state, you're not going to keep doing that unless you're getting something in return. There can be a problem, though, if you move from this kind of repeated interaction to what you could think of as a more one-shot game, which does give people incentives to cheat. And so the kind of extraordinary wealth generation that happens and the extraordinary corruption that happened in China, especially at the end of the Hu Jintao, beginning of the Xi Jinping era, created incentives for local officials to really, treat their position in the local government as an ATM. And this means that, if they're doing things like trying to requisition land and get people off it and using these social organizations to do it, it can really erode the credibility and social fabric of villages, especially in rural China. using these more informal strategies. It can really erode social ties. So it's not something that that all states can kind of do all the time. I think the second big picture limit or change that happens over time is I do think there have been changes over time in the degree to which the state uses less, I suppose, formal strategies like cultivating social groups and cultivating, even NGOs as a way to help the state provide services and governance and control society, and more formal, more to a certain extent coercive strategies like the strategy of infiltration, like using party organizations, neighborhood committees to try to implement policy. So I think you've seen a shift from the Hu Jintao era to the Xi Jinping era in how the state views and uses local civil society to govern. So I think in the Hu Jintao era, there was more of an emphasis on the strategies of kind of cultivation, co-optation, creating and allowing, in many cases, social groups to thrive and to organize themselves, at least to the degree that they help the state govern and provide services. And whether it was, at the local level in rural China, things like lineage and kinship associations, music groups, or in urban China, things like labor NGOs. And there was some room in the Hu Jintao era for these organizations to exist, to organize people, but they existed so long as they were useful for the state to make society more kind of legible, to control society, to provide services. Now in the Xi Jinping era, I think there's been this turn towards the harder tools of repression, especially in places like Xinjiang, but also in a lot of society, the tool using infiltration, especially party cells, residence committees in urban China, the grid management system, which is a policing system of where cities are literally divided into kind of grids, and in rural China, village or small groups, which is something you see really vividly happening with the coronavirus response on maybe the kind of positive side, where the government under Xi really relied on residence committees to monitor and enforce quarantines a year ago. In February, March of 2020, it was these urban neighborhood committees, these residence committees that were checking people in, taking temperatures, and enforcing quarantines. And formal party organizations too, like party cells in firms, have also become increasingly important. So while under Xi Jinping, the Communist Party has done a lot to try to shut down civil society groups that are allowed to exist in the Hu Jintao era. So you've seen this kind of rebalancing, this move towards infiltration over through these kind of more easy, directly to control organizations instead of cultivation. But I think the downside to that for the Communist Party is it's less flexible and, in a sense, more brittle than the way that the Communist Party governed under Hu Jintao. That was a long-winded answer.
Sorry. No, it's good. It's really interesting. I guess this is a good point to pick up. You mentioned before the ways that you sort of measure the effectiveness of these tools of coercive social control or political control, you could say. So you talk about the systems of land expropriation, family planning and protest. So I'm wondering if you can talk to each of these points about how this plays out through these systems of political control, these coercive systems, firstly about land expropriation, and then perhaps the impact of family planning policies over the past 40 years, and then the scope for protest in Chinese villages, and whether or not they're curbed, if at all, especially in terms of, how you measure the effectiveness of this sort of political coercion in rural China.
Yeah. So when it first, I want to tackle each of those, I guess, one by one. So when it comes to to land requisitions, I mean, I think land rights have really been at the center of politics in China since the early 1900s. I think Sun Yat-sen who recognized that basically whoever solves the land problem will for the Chinese for Chinese farmers, for the Chinese peasantry, will have essentially one China. And Sun Yat-sen was right. Of course, it was Mao and the CCP that came to power partly in the back of a rural peasant-led revolution promising land redistribution, which of course the Communist Party did in the early 1950s, taking land away from landlords, often violently, or probably over 1 million people, dead in that 1950 to 1953 period, and redistributed land to farmers, to poor farmers, and ultimately equalized land holdings. So you have this first great redistribution of land in the early 1950s, and the system of collective agriculture that the CCP devised under Mao was, of course, a gigantic failure in equalizing livelihood, making people's lives better, making people prosperous and wealthy. The changes to the political system that happened at the very tail end of the Mao era and during the beginning of the Deng era, to give responsibility back to households to be able to cultivate their land rather than to farm in collectives, was really the engine that started this great, eradication of poverty and rise to wealth of the Chinese political system. But the next kind of great land redistribution started really happening in the late 90s, early 2000s, when the farmers in China today don't have individual, full, in the Western sense, property rights to land. Farmers can't sell their land. They can rent it out, but you can't sell it. Instead, in order to sell land has to be essentially confiscated, requisitions by local governments. And so what does this mean? Well, this kind of curious, strange legacy of the socialist period means that in order for land development to happen, or for urbanization to happen, or for industrialization to happen, you often have local governments essentially requisitioning land from farmers for compensating farmers on average significantly less than it's worth, and then developing the land. So the good thing that you get from this is development, urbanization, and wealth creation, taking people out of poverty. The bad thing is that ultimately this is happening on balance on the back of farmers. It's not always bad, but as the survey data I have in the book shows, from nationally representative surveys, on average, farmers are getting a kind of bad deal from this, even if on balance maybe it's good for China, it's not good for these farmers. And so the question then is how do these local governments move farmers off their land for significantly less than it's worth? How are they essentially reversing this great triumph of the Chinese Communist Party of the 1950s of equalizing land holdings in what's essentially a regressive redistribution of land from relatively poor smallholding farmers to now the land is being given to developers. And certainly at the end of the Hu Jintao era, these officials making gobs of money from doing this. So that's the reason why land requisition is important. And again, going back, how is this accomplished? Partly through these social groups, whether it's Xi Jinping using lineage networks to try to push people off land for a dam, or it's an official in Guangdong using the prestige that they've earned through creating these dance troupes to try to squeeze people off their land. It's a kind of central question for understanding the livelihood of farmers and people in China. The second question about family planning policy, this is again was a major objective of the Chinese Communist Party starting really in the 70s, really before the one-child policy was promulgated, under Mao. There's the later, longer, fewer campaign where they're trying to encourage lower fertility rates. This really took off, of course, in the Deng era. There's a big debate in demography, which, I'm not a demographer, so I can't speak to this as an expert about, what's the actual kind of causal effect of the one-child policy on preventing births. It's not zero, but it's also probably not, probably didn't reduce fertility by hundreds and hundreds of millions because, as countries get wealthier as China has, fertility naturally declines anyway, even in the absence of these kinds of policy interventions. But in rural China, the one-child policy was generally, especially compared to urban China, relatively less popular. And getting people to comply with it, and again, in rural China, was relatively difficult. And so, the question for village officials was, how could you actually monitor households and ensure compliance with this pretty difficult to enforce policy? And again, the argument in the book is like a lot of these groups are useful for, or were useful when policy was still strongly in effect, for monitoring people at the local level.
Right. And so I guess bringing these points together, I'm wondering, with these sort of regressive redistribution of land policies and, relatively unpopular one-child policies in rural areas, can you tell me, and then there's also this tamping down on protests that you write about as well in the book. Can you tell me a bit more about how a strong civil society actually strengthens state capacity in these realms to sort of get these policies done?
Yeah. So the kind of core argument here of the book is that in order to get these policies done, it's useful to have local officials, especially at the grassroots, at this kind of interface between state and society, basically where the government or the state meets society. Governments need, one, information, and two, they need bureaucrats, officials at the local level who are able to implement policy and actually get things done. So of course it's important to understand what's happening in places like Beijing, but it's also, what happens at the grassroots, whether it's in a village in rural China or at the neighborhood level. That's kind of, in many ways, like the substance of governance. So these social groups are useful for making society more legible. In other words, making it easier for officials to understand and kind of count where people are and understand what their preferences are. They're also useful for cultivating norms that are useful for the state, especially norms of deference to authority and elders. They're also useful in a pretty direct way when it comes to these infiltrating organizations like neighborhood committees, for just having the kind of arms and ears at the local level to implement policy and to monitor people and tell people what needs to be done.
Right. And
I'm not sure if that answered. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, no, it's fine. It actually does. Because you also write the flip side of informal control is that communities which lack strong social organizations maintain the possibility to mount spontaneous leaderless resistance. So I'm wondering if you can expand on this a little bit.
Yeah, so this is something that we saw on the international stage with the protests in Hong Kong and in Spain, which is, we saw protests happening that were, generally leaderless. There weren't single, clear, identifiable groups that were organizing these protests or leaders, partly out of necessity because they're trying to evade the police, evade the state, and having kind of learned lessons from prior protests where leaders had been arrested. So in places like Hong Kong and the protests that happened in Catalan, people organizing through social media, using Telegram and other Signal, of these other apps, to try to organize without organizations. which seems kind of paradoxical, but has allowed these groups to thrive in a relatively decentralized way that was hard for the state to stop. And then one of the interesting things is that I found in my research, this book was written well before the protests in Hong Kong or Catalonia and came out. I put the book to bed, sent it to the publisher before the protests even started. But this is something that I had observed in rural China years before these protests, really kind of similar tactics where, it helped groups to not have these groups because it made it harder to not have strong civil society organizations, because it just made it marginally a little bit harder for officials to figure out what was happening in local society. Because if you have even at the village level, if you have village officials who are kind of in a sense insulated from local society, maybe they're spending time at the local social club playing cards or whatever, playing mahjong instead of and don't necessarily have deep roots in village society, they might not be aware of who's discontented about a particular land deal. They might not be aware of Mr. and Ms. Wang, who are organizing a kind of like pop-up protest against a planned plastic factory that will be built on village land for no compensation to villagers. If you lack these connections to village society, it's harder to monitor and control it. So one of the things I saw in years before these protests in Hong Kong or Catalonia is villagers using similar tactics, doing things like trying to organize quasi-anonymously, using pretty analog sometimes tactics like going and this is in the days before ubiquitous surveillance, postering the village to say, hey, let's all meet at such and such a time at the village square to protest this land requisition, and then you get almost a kind of like flash mob that appears through this pretty analog technique of organization. And so, that's one of to me, the surprising things. One of the most effective ways to organize was to have this kind of leaderless protest.
And that's really interesting. So just building on, you touched on this before about co-optation. So in addition to cultivating civil society, one of the key themes and key mechanisms that your research shows is that co-optation is relatively effective at, promoting a degree of political control. Can you talk a little bit about how co-optation operates in China's rural villages, and what the incentives are for compliance?
Yeah, so in rural China, you think about co-optation in general is a strategy that a lot of authoritarian regimes use in order to try to govern society. Co-opting local notables is pretty useful for authoritarian regimes from Egypt to China. So in rural China, this could often mean doing things like identifying the leaders of lineage groups, for example, would be important local leaders who have a lot of prestige and authority within their group. So some lineage groups are quite organized and have a single person who's their identifiable kind of lineage group head. Often this is they're generally men in the relatively patriarchal society of places in say eastern Guangdong. Not always, but often men who are seen as someone who's really capable and effective within their lineage group. So these lineage kind of chiefs, these lineage heads, often become a kind of point person for local officials who want to implement policy. So talking to village officials, if you want to requisition land for a new road project, what do you do? Well, the first thing that you need to do is go to one of these lineage heads to try to get them on board. And because then they'll use their own prestige within the lineage group to to try to get people to comply with the policy. So if you have one of these lineage group heads who is outside of the state and can essentially act as a broker, a go-between between the state and the lineage group, that can be good for the lineage group in that this one person can help to organize people, help to solve the collective action problem that's inherent in trying to act together as a group and make sure that people aren't selfish. And can kind of essentially be a bulwark in a sense against the state. However, if these lineage group heads have been co-opted by the local state, either by maybe becoming a member of the village government, becoming a member of the village committee, becoming a member of the village communist party branch, this can actually be tremendously useful. Like it can then create incentives for these lineage heads to act in ways that maybe, on balance, it shifts their incentives towards taking actions that benefits the state and the party a little bit more than if they weren't a member of these organizations. Because if you're on the village committee, whether it's maybe some corruption or financial advantage you might get from, say, a land deal, or if you're a party member, just party discipline can encourage you to help the party to implement policy if you're not necessarily engaging in corruption. So at the very local grassroots level, the strategy of co-optation can be quite useful.
And then the final area of political coercion you write about is infiltration. So you have a chapter on infiltration, and in this chapter you focus on its strategy, where you write, networks of grassroots informants, each of them in charge of a local cell, can substitute the strategy of using non-state groups to govern. I'm wondering if you can talk more about how infiltration of civil society groups work and why it would be used as a substitute for cultivating civil society and co-optation.
Yeah, so this is another strategy that's used by authoritarian states outside of China. It's also been used by states in China before the PRC. So the idea behind infiltration is you have states that create essentially these parastate groups that like neighborhood committees, village or small groups, party cells at the local level that are used. In other words, that ask individuals to essentially hold other individuals within their social group accountable for things that the state wants. So you could look back through Chinese history to the Baojia system that set up in China from that was effective in China from the Song Dynasty onwards. These kind of like mutual responsibility systems that ask people in imperial China to police their neighbors, report their neighbors, collect revenue from the state by under the Baojia system or the Lijia system. You'd have groups of 10 or 100 households where you'd have one household that would rotate over time who would be responsible for ensuring compliance with the law and for helping to collect revenue. That kind of older system now, there's a kind of echo in it in the neighborhood committees in urban China, the residence committees that are responsible for implementing policy and for monitoring people at the local level. So earlier I was talking about the coronavirus, implementing the coronavirus restrictions, which was something that had kind of public goods benefits, but of course was also a political control function of the state. The ability to control society and implement these quarantines is certainly an example of political control. The strategy of infiltration is also useful for doing things like enforcing the one-child policy. So these neighborhood committees, residence committees are essential for monitoring people and ensuring compliance with the one-child policy. So if you have someone who's kind of the neighborhood minder who's asked to report to the neighborhood village party secretary about which families might be expecting or not, and are they having a child who's over the birth quota. These institutions are really useful for the state in monitoring and controlling society. And as I mentioned before, I think you've seen this shift from the Hu era to the Xi era, and focusing more on the strategy of infiltration, focusing more on using the party and parastate organizations like neighborhood committees to implement policy, and a little bit less on cultivating, subverting, co-opting civil society.
And then bringing all of these points together, in the conclusion, you raise a really interesting question by your research. You ask, how durable is informal repression as a tool of control? So how durable do you think it is?
I think it's quite durable. I mean, I think that even though all authoritarian governments, all states, even democratic governments, really rely on different methods of political control over time. I think it's in a sense inescapable for governments to, at least to some extent, to rely on these less formal methods of political control. There's a quote from Hannah Arendt that I mentioned in the book that where force is used, authority itself has failed. So anytime states have to rely on coercion for political control, and violent coercion for political control, it usually means that these other tools of political control to get people to comply with the state in a kind of quasi-voluntary way have failed. So I think that the Chinese state will continue to use these, even if repression, even if society continues to be relatively closed as it is under Xi Jinping, even if it's relying more on infiltration, less on cultivating and subverting civil society, the state essentially can't escape from using it. And you see Xi Jinping talking a lot about things like the Feng Qiao experience, which are basically using society to control itself through mobilizing people at the local level to monitor each other and ensure compliance with the state. So you're not going to see this. You're not going to see this go away. So I think in the long run, it's a pretty durable strategy.
Yeah, and in that space, you quote sociologist Fei Xiaotong, who in 1947 wrote, "China is above all a rural society." So bringing all of your research together, there were so many great qualitative studies and surveys. I'm interested to know, what are the implications of this rise in this rural society, especially with regards to China's rise in the world?
I love talking about Fei Xiaotong. Like "xiangzhu zhongguo" is like one of my favorite books. Definitely recommend. There's a good the Chinese version is relatively accessible even to a non-native speaker like me. There's also great translation at the University of California Press. So China is so Fei wrote that China is above all a rural society. Not true now, right? Like this classic book of sociology is about China, back in the true in the pre-Mao era and even true through the 1980s, but not today anymore. But I think the interesting thing to me about rural society as a political scientist is I think it lays bare in a lot of ways as a researcher and someone who wants to try to understand society, like seeing this kind of society in miniature in like rural. And I also come from Vermont, from like a pretty rural town in the United States. But you can kind of see how society works in a kind of miniature way, in a way that's kind of easy to understand, but it's in a way that's kind of harder to understand at the national level. So I just love talking and thinking about rural society, partly for that reason. But back to your question about like what are the implications of this for China's rise in the world? Well, even though China is no longer primarily a rural society, it's all of China is connected to rural China in ways that are interesting and unusual, partly because of this, the legacy of the socialist system where people are still tied to their land and their land rights, and partly because, migration means that in the hukou system, the residency system that characterizes China means that people are still, their citizenship is tied to their rural village. So in a way, it's kind of, for people in China, it's kind of inescapable. And so I think it's important, still remains important substantively to understand rural China today, in addition to whatever kind of general lessons for governance that might have. And the other reason that rural China is important is, if you want to understand poverty eradication, which is one of the most important lessons of China. Like you have to understand what's happening in rural China and what people in rural China have done and what's happened in rural China. So there are, incredible, amazing parts of the story, poverty eradication, and one of them, of course, is just understanding how did rural China develop. But the other piece of that is understanding the kind of, in a sense, more political, less economic story of it, which is, how did the state actually get things done, which is really hard for developing states. So understanding political control in rural China, I think, is important for governments around the world.
That's really interesting. I really like that way you describe it and think about it as rural society being sort of society in miniature. It's fascinating. So you've said that you think this is fairly durable, and that we understand rural China to understand more. It's sort of indicative of what's going on more broadly. So then, bringing everything together, in your conclusion, you write about what might be likely to be the best check on authoritarian power. So then what do you think is likely to be the best check on authoritarian power?
As I write about in the book, I think at the very end of the book, it partly is the ability to have some kind of social organization that's free from state power, which in rural China has meant, in order for farmers to protect their rights, protect their land rights, often this has meant organizing and protesting against the local state, right? Not protesting against Communist Party rule, not protesting against the national government, but protesting against corrupt local officials who are requisitioning land without giving a lot of money to people. Protesting against local officials who overstep the bounds when trying to enforce family planning policy. In order to do that, I think you need really vigorous protests and opposition. Of course, that's hard in an authoritarian system. I argue that it's actually, in a surprising way, sometimes easier without social organizations, the kinds of social organizations in the West we might associate with a robust civil society, with political accountability. Are less obviously useful in an authoritarian context. So the best check against authoritarian power, I argue in the book, is protest, is collective action, and holding officials accountable. How do you get there? Well, there's no one size fits all answer to that question. But I think, as you've seen from rural China, as I read about in my book, to Hong Kong and elsewhere, it's often places that are able to use the tactic of leaderless protests that are best able to organize.
And actually, I must say that your book is really interesting reading in this time, on this topic of protest and sort of resistance against authoritarian power. It's very applicable to these times, I should say. Now, Dan, I've taken up a lot of your time, but just before you go, I'm wondering if you can tell me what you're working on now.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks so much for those kind words. So, what am I working on now? I'm working on my next book, which is, so this book was about the kind of non-violent, non-coercive tools used by the Chinese state in rural China, which of course made me wonder about the opposite, the things I didn't write about in this book, which is understanding the role of political violence in China over time. So my next book project. My book project's based on this in-depth qualitative field research, a lot of kind of interview research, which meant that it was kind of bound in time to the end of the Hu Jintao era and into the Xi Jinping era, that kind of decade. So now my next project is looking at the role of political violence, the role of the military and elite politics in China, and taking a kind of more historical look, trying to understand how, who holds the power of the gun has shaped Chinese politics from 1911 to now. It's a very different kind of project than this last one.
Well, when you get done, you'll have to we'll have to have you back on the show, because that also sounds really interesting, and I think it will sort of complement your work by sort of pushing the literature in a different direction. So definitely we'll have you back. It sounds super interesting.
Thanks so much, Jane. I really appreciate you having me on here. This is a lot of fun.
Oh, it's been great. So just to sum it all up, I'm Jane Richards, and I've been speaking with Daniel Mattingly about his book, The Art of Political Control in China. Dan Mattingly, thank you for your time.
Thank you.